Hi everybody. I'm Jeff Bull, and not even checking my notes, I can say that I am a teacher in the General Arts and Sciences stream of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Humber College, and it's my honor to be the host today of our talk and to thank you for coming to our fifth of 6 presentations this year in the President's Lecture Series, where today we'll have the great pleasure of hearing Dr. Brian Goldman, emergency room physician and host of White Coat Black Art on CBC Radio, speaking to us about the secret language of doctors, cracking the code of hospital culture. Now, as it's often done before we start these talks, I'd like to give some thanks to people who've helped us bring this lecture and our whole lecture series through the years, and in the future we hope to you. So first to my fellow President's Lecture Series committee members, Angela Aujla, Melanie Chaparian, Chandra Hodgson, and our chair, Ian Gary. I'd also like to say thanks to Media Services at Humber, who do such a spectacular job every time, especially the excellent technicians here who've helped us set up today. Say thank you to the President's Executive Assistant, Deborah Green, and of course to our President, Chris Whitaker, whom we'd like to thank for his continuing support of this lecture series. As mentioned, this is our 5th of 6 lectures this year, and I just want to go over some of the other ones we've had so you're aware, if you didn't get to see them, of what we did. Last fall we heard from Nora Young, another CBC host, this time of Spark, who talked about seeing the forest and the trees, surviving and thriving in the coming data boom. We also heard from lawyer Stephen Wise, who spoke on the struggle for non-human rights and legal personhood of non-human animals by the Human Rights Project. And near the end of the term, we heard from Jennifer Hollett, political pundit, who described to the Lakeshore audience what happens when digital gets political. Just last month, Paula Todd, formerly of TVO, spoke at the Lakeshore about extreme mean, trolls, bullies, predators, and you online. Now, the reason I mention all these is because they are all available on our video archive, which you can get to if you follow the President's Lecture Series link on the School of Arts and Sciences website. And Dr. Goldman's lecture will be going up there shortly. In fact, we have lectures going back at least 10 years in this series that are available for people in the Humber community to download and learn from. In fact, I'd say these are a great research and lecturing tool, so why not have a poke around in there and see if there's something that you might be able to use. We have one more lecture, as I said, this term. That'll be on Thursday, March the 26th at 1:30 in this room, 7th semester. We'll hear from Dr. Ward Struthers from York University's Department of Psychology, and he'll be talking about understanding the power of apology in decisions to seek revenge, harbor a grudge, and forgive. Let me give you a reminder, too, that notice of this talk and all President's Lecture Series talks can be found on the Humber Communique, on Humber TV, on HSF bulletin boards, as well as at our links on Facebook, Google+, and if you like to tweet, on Twitter at HumberPLS. Now, the PLS, or President's Lecture Series, aims to connect all of Humber with ideas and thinkers of note. So we're really pleased to see that so many different members of the community are here today, not just professors and support staff, but administrators and, most wonderfully, students. Thank you for coming. Welcome. Welcome, too, to everybody else who's tuning in through our live cast link to the Lakeshore and Orangeville campuses. And I've been asked in particular to offer a special welcome to the nursing and sociology of health students who have come here thanks to the efforts of Konstantin Belagris and Alexander Schwartz. Now, I'm not sure if Dr. Goldman's material will be on your exam, but I am sure that he will help unveil some of the mysteries related to your areas of study, so it's good that you're here. Now we get to my favorite part of being the moderator, which is where I get to tell everyone to turn off their cell phones. Because I don't have a cell phone, and I find them a little strange and perplexing, and so maybe in my evil way, I like this feeling that I've done something that seems to bother a lot of people, asking them to turn off their cell phones. But I want you to know it's for a good cause that you turn off your phone. No one wants to hear your cray-cray ringtone in the middle of Dr. Goldman's talk. So, shut her down. If you cannot last an hour or 90 minutes without texting someone, you're free to leave the room and do that outside, but just leave politely and quietly and don't turn on your phone until you're out the door. I'll remind you, too, that we do have a question and answer session after the talk. So if you think of something you'd like to ask Dr. Goldman during his presentation, make note of it and feel free to ask the question after. We have microphones set up. You can see one over there. And we need you to ask the question into the microphone if you can, because this Q&A session is also live cast and the people at other places want to hear your questions. If you cannot get to the microphone for a particular reason, I'm happy to run a microphone over to you if we have to. So just put up your hand and let me know, and we'll see to that. So what I'm going to do now is turn things over to Sarah Delian of our nursing program, who's going to introduce our guest lecturer today, Dr. Brian Goldman.
In the trenches for more than 20 years, Dr. Brian Goldman is a graduate of University of Toronto and a respected emergency room physician at Mount Sinai Hospital. He is one of Canada's most trusted voices in medicine, a doctor who thinks like a patient. He has worked as a health reporter for CBC Television's The Health Show, as well as The National, its flagship news program. He served as senior production executive during the launch year of the Discovery Health Channel, Canada's only 24-hour channel devoted to health programming. His CBC radio show, The House Doctor, is syndicated in 20 markets across Canada. You may also know him from CBC Radio 1's White Coat, Black Art, where he takes listeners behind the scenes of medical offices to discuss a variety of health topics. In addition to all this, Dr. Goldman is the author of 2 books, The Night Shift, Real Life in the Heart of the ER, and The Secret Language of Doctors, themes from which he will speak about today. We are very happy to have him participate in our series. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Goldman.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that kind introduction, and thanks to Jeff. I'm going to rename you Noble. My daughter, Kaylee, is turning 17 this year, and I've been looking very closely at this campus. Do you think my daughter should come here? Yes. You can do better than that. Come on. All right. Okay. All right. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here. I love speaking to students because I have a memory of being a student. In fact, one of the worst memories of my life was as a senior medical student at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And when I was at Johns Hopkins, I was doing an elective in neurology. I had plans to become a neurologist. This was in my final year of medical school. Electives are those free months when you get to try on for size a potential residency. And I went down to Baltimore in order to score a great letters of recommendation so I could get that residency in the United States. It could have been Johns Hopkins, it could have been Columbia Presbyterian, it could have been Harvard, it could have been Stanford. And the idea is that I would return to Canada with my BA. And if you're wondering what that means, BA stands for been away. And once you have your been away, you know that thing, that self-loathing thing that goes on in Canada where we hate ourselves, we hate uppity performers, then they go to the United States and become famous, and then we love them. And how does that happen? Anyway, I was going to get my BA, and I was a chronic insomniac. In fact, I was the professor of insomnia. I had this tendency to wake up early each and every morning, often 4 o'clock in the morning. And but there was one morning when I didn't wake up early. In fact, I slept in. And that was the morning, unfortunately, that I was supposed to be presenting grand rounds in the Department of Neurology at Johns Hopkins. That was going to be the morning when I was going to present a case, an interesting case, and some literature search, and I was going to impress the hell out of them, and that was going to seal the deal for my residency. And I slept in. I actually got up at 4, went to the bathroom for a quick pee, went back to bed. I didn't usually fall back to sleep, but this morning I did. I happened to wake up at 10 a.m., which was exactly the moment when I was supposed to be presenting rounds. And I remember running across North Wilf Street after I had hastily dressed myself and up the flights of stairs to the neurology floor, got to the back of the neurology conference room, very much like this one, maybe a little bit smaller, and there I was at the back of the room, and my nemesis, the senior resident in neurology who hated my guts, was standing at the front delivering my rounds in my stead. And he took one look at me, and those of you, I guess your grandparents would know that way back in the Stone Age there was a movie called The Graduate with Dustin Hoffman. And there's this delicious moment when Dustin Hoffman is at the back of the church and he's screaming to Elaine. Elaine's about to get married, and this is his soulmate. And she's about to get married to somebody else, and he's screaming, Elaine, Elaine. And I had that Elaine kind of face. And my senior resident caught one look at me and smiled, a really sadistic smile, and said, "It's okay, Brian, you're too late." And everybody laughed. Now, if you've ever had one of those performance anxiety dreams, and I had a lot of those in my day of, slow motion to get to class the last day of, and because I'd missed all term in my dream. And I thought if I could just get there to catch the last hour, I might learn just enough to cram and pass the exam. And of course, as soon as I arrive, the bell goes off and the doors open and I've missed the last class. So this was a living nightmare for me. It was the worst day of my life. And after about 6 years of therapy, why are you laughing? There's nothing funny about that at all. It was the best day of my life. Because I wouldn't be standing here in front of you right now talking about what I'm about to talk about today, which is the culture of medicine, as a kind of an embedded medical sociologist on the front lines, if I didn't have that moment when, for whatever reason, call it a guardian angel if you're religious or spiritual, call it an id, call it just me finally giving myself the message saying, Goldman, you have no interest in becoming a neurologist. Yes, it's interesting, although it got really boring once they invented the CT scan. Really? No, really. Finding the lesion was where it was at. And then suddenly this picture is like, what are we going to do now? Anyway, and then they invented MRI, even worse. But the point is that I got the message, and then I started to backtrack in my career, and about a year later, I published my first article in the Globe and Mail, then another one, and then I finally decided to duck out of residency, and I did. And I found emergency medicine in a way that's hard to find today. People back then could moonlight. Today it's not so easy to moonlight, but a few of my friends, I was doing a year of internal medicine after a year of pediatrics, and a few of my fellow residents were starting to do some shifts in the emergency department, and I did it, and I liked it, and more important, it liked me, and it gave me, it was a perfect career, stimulating. You get to make a difference, and it was part-time enough that I had time to write, and that's how I started to put my writing career together. And I guess I'm sure there'll be some of you who want to know, how did you do it? I'll be happy to answer questions about that. But one article after another, and then I started to write some magazine articles. I discovered you could travel and write about medicine in other countries, and then I sold my first radio documentary on prescription drug traffickers to a show called Sunday Morning, which doesn't exist anymore. They call it the Sunday edition, but it's kind of that's kind of the son or the daughter of Sunday Morning, which was one of the top current affairs shows at the CBC in the mid to late 1980s, and it had been around, I guess, for about 20 or 30 years at that point. Then I had a little bit of time in television and then back to radio, and about 8 years ago I came up with the idea for White Coat Black Art, and really for me that was the career switch that kind of propelled me in a new direction, which was, I'd been putting together the rudiments of it. I had always been interested in the things that people say in healthcare when they think that patients and families aren't listening, and how their words would change instantly if the patient walked by or if they were talking to patients. And I wanted to be able to bring those voices to the public, and to my delight, I discovered that people wanted to hear it. And that's how I came to be here. So what I'm going to talk about today is a direct outgrowth of my work on White Coat Black Art and the two books that I've written, particularly The Secret Language of Doctors. I'm going to talk to you about slang as a serious subject called argot, and I'm going to define that in a little bit. We can call it slang, but argot or argot is a serious area of study, and I'll explain why. And then we'll get to the heart of the matter to talk about what that slang reveals about various aspects of medical culture, and I'm going to focus on, situational slang in healthcare, situations that we confront as health professionals that evoke strong emotional reactions for whatever reason. There is specific slang for aging patients who are bariatric, who are dangerously obese, and other marginalized populations, homeless, people who return to the hospital again and again. We also have some slang for colleagues and allied health professionals. And in particular, at that point, I'm going to focus on errors and the curious slang that we have for errors. And then we come to the point when I ask, what's the point? What do you do with slang? Do you stamp it out? Do you encourage it? Or do you find some kind of a middle ground? And hopefully I'll leave lots of time for questions with that. First of all, how did I come to write The Secret Language of Doctors? Well, a very interesting thing, and I can give you lots of lessons for life. One of the lessons for life that I'll give you is to take rejection with a grain of salt. In fact, if I said to you that every good thing I've ever done on this earth has come from a mistake or a setback, would you believe me? Please do. Because if you are vigilant and learn lessons from the mistakes that you make and the setbacks that you have, you'll learn far more from them than you'll ever learn from your successes. Because people aren't good at unpacking success. It's interesting how they blame themselves for mistakes and attribute their successes to luck. And if you're ever before I'm not a mentor but a director, a boss, if you ever attributed a mistake to bad luck, they'd probably want to talk to you about that. Anyway, interestingly, White Coat Black Art started as a book proposal called Medical BS. And that book proposal got an agent, shopped it around. He shopped it around to about 25 different publishers. One or two sniffs, one or two editors sort of liked it, but they rejected it. They all found it too negative. That seemed to be the common thread of the criticisms that I received. I guess, fortunately there was a CBC because it wasn't too negative for them. I reworked the proposal into a potential radio series, and they didn't say, let's make a series. They said, in fact, I remember distinctly the words that Ramona Deering, who was on the program committee, she's a producer, she's now the host of Radio Noon in St. John's. She called me up and she gave me feedback on the proposal. She said, we're not saying yes, and my heart sank. And then she said, but we're not saying no. Why don't you get together with a couple of producers and see if you can develop this more, because we're not sure from this proposal what the radio show is going to sound like, and that's kind of important. And so I met with a couple of producers, and we kind of fleshed out what turned into White Coat Black Art. And what's interesting is that one of the publishers that rejected Medical BS came back to me after the show was an evident success and asked my agent, can Brian write a book? And, well, no, since you said no the first time, it'll be no forever. No, of course I wrote a book. And that became The Night Shift. And that was an hour-by-hour, it's called literary nonfiction. All the patients are not real patients, but they are, and that's what you have to do if you're going to write in the world about what it's like. And that's kind of where all of us who are involved in literary nonfiction, who are basing our experiences on life in the hospital, are trying to accomplish. We're trying to create a sense of reality using patients that are not real. And I'm very good at doing that. One of the reasons why I'm good at doing that is I've spent many years as a radio documentary producer, and you learn to construct and deconstruct stories. And you have plot points, and you have climaxes, and you have denouements, and you have crises for characters, and they have to have high stakes. And it's not hard to, if you've been exposed to that kind of experience in your career, in your work, it's not hard to do that. So that became The Night Shift. The Night Shift was a modest enough success that HarperCollins came back to me and said, Brian, can you write another book? And I went through the sophomore jinx of about 2 or 3 ideas for books. And that's very hard to write a second book. The first one was kind of a memoir, an hour-by-hour account of what it's like to work in the emergency department. Then at one point, my editor, Jim Gifford, said, that book, How Doctors Think, by Jerome Groopman, which is a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, it was a New York Times bestseller. It takes cognitive errors, cognitive psychology, and the errors that we make when we see a patient who's intoxicated and just see their intoxicated behavior and miss the fact that they have a subdural hematoma, or they're having a heart attack. And what Jerome Groopman did was he took this wonderful science of cognitive psychology and popularized it into a book and peppered it with his own cases, his own patients, where he had made mistakes. So he came clean on his own mistakes. So Jim Gifford said to me, how about you write a book called How Doctors Talk? That was the conceptual, the idea, the one-line expression for the book. And it's very interesting. So I started to think about how I was going to approach this. And, I think he thought I was going to be spending hours explaining Code Blue. And it's, very interesting. Code Blue, it was an obscure phrase. The idea behind Code Blue was that you could say it over a hospital loudspeaker and nobody would understand. Nobody would panic if you heard Code Blue. It sounded neutral. Of course, once it got popularized on shows like Grey's Anatomy and Scrubs, it ceased to be jargon, and it just got into the vernacular. And defibrillators and clear and all that kind of stuff is part of that lore. I realized very quickly that I'd get very bored saying that DM2 is short for type 2 diabetes, or ACS is acute coronary syndrome, used to be called an MI, and unstable angina and all that kind of stuff. It's like, that's pretty boring stuff if you think about it. It's just, it's one-dimensional. What's the purpose? Well, I'm sure there's bragging rights, who gets to name the disease. I guess that's mildly interesting, but a lot of it is just packing a ton of information into a short number of words. Far more interesting when you start to look at argot or argot. And let's see if I can actually, I got to use this better. Okay, so that's what I came up with. Argot, and it's very interesting because I remembered that there was a book about slang, which is a touchstone for me, and I'm going to get into explaining that in a couple of minutes. Very, very important book from the 1970s called The House of God. I'm going to talk about that. And so I remembered that was my introduction to slang, and I'll talk about my first introduction to slang. Yeah, I guess I could talk about it right now. I was working on the cardiology floor, 4A, 4B, at the Hospital for Sick Children back in 1980. Long time ago. That was a very, very stressful year in the life of the Hospital for Sick Children, because this was the year when there appeared to be a series of unexplained baby deaths. And if you may even remember, you may have heard of it, you may have read about it, that one of my nursing colleagues, Susan Nellis, was arrested and charged with murder. She was eventually found not guilty, and it turned out that the reason why there was an excess number of deaths had more to do with the statistical anomaly of placement, where the patients were and where they weren't. That they were dying on the floor when at another time in another place they would have died in the intensive care unit. But it was the same number. If you added it up, it was still the same number of deaths. But for a long time, they thought that these children had been killed with an overdose of digoxin, which is a heart medication, not used so much these days, but was used a lot more back then. So I was working on the cardiology floor at a time when they were second-guessing themselves, and there was a lot of stress going on. And on my first night on call, I had a senior resident he was my dude. His name was George Rutherford III. George Rutherford III came from Stanford, so his idea was that he was going to work at the Hospital for Sick Children, and that was going to be his BA, and he was going to go back to the States. I think he went to the London School of Tropical Disease and went back to Stanford, and has had a long and storied career as a public health specialist and as an infectious disease consultant. But he was my cool dude. And he taught me some slang, a lot of things that I'm not sure that I'd want to repeat today because some of it was a little pejorative towards kids. But that night, I had been on call and I'd been up all night and I was really, really tired that morning, and I must have had a very forlorn look on my face. Well, George Rutherford III walked up to me. He wasn't on call that night, and put a big reassuring hand on my shoulder and said to me, "Well, Brian, how many did you box last night?" As in, put into a coffin. And I was ready to throw up or faint, and then his face broke out in a big grin. And that was George Rutherford III introducing me to argot, to slang. And I can tell you that honestly I felt like I'd been welcomed to the club. I was shocked shocked at the coarseness of the language, but at the same time I was pleased that I'd been introduced into the secret language. That was my introduction to the secret language of doctors. And, at the time, everybody was reading a book called The House of God, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And so one of the things I wanted to be able to do was see how much slang was being invented today, because it seemed so important to us back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when The House of God was first published. And I interviewed probably, a couple of hundred residents and medical students and attending physicians and surgeons. I had a researcher, Erin James Abra, who was working with me. She's now an editor in Encyclopedia Britannica. She's a good writer in her own right. And we were collecting these stories about slang, and, we'd get some good stories, and we'd go through dry spells where people would say, there is no slang. And then I had a very important conversation. First of all, an email exchange. Somebody suggested to me that I get in touch with Renee Fox. If you study medical sociology, you know the name Renee Fox. Renee Fox is the doyen of medical sociologists. Her PhD thesis, Experiment Perilous, basically she was an embedded sociologist on a ward at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston at a very, very interesting and pivotal time in that ward in experimental clinical science, clinical research. This was at a time in the early 1950s when cortisone had first come into its own as a treatment as a powerful anti-inflammatory drug for rheumatoid arthritis and a lot of other conditions. This was the beginning of the dawn of the era of kidney transplants, and they were doing some crazy things on that floor. Things like doing adrenalectomies, taking the adrenal glands out to cure patients of hypertension, high blood pressure, and things that we don't do today. But she was embedded on the front lines, and she was absorbing the dark humor used by these scientists who realized that at the same time that they were pushing back the frontiers, they were also killing patients. And the ambivalence that they would feel about asking somebody who was evidently, obviously dying for another set of blood tests to try to push back those frontiers even more. She was the first person, when I spoke to her on the phone, she said, because there were moments when I second-guessed myself about the book. Should I write this book? And she said, you must write this book. This is so important. And she started to talk about argot. It's the first time that slang had a formal term, argot or argot. It is a secret language used by various groups, including but not limited to thieves and other criminals. Purpose is to prevent outsiders from understanding their conversations. Argot. So I want you to just cogitate on, that image of robbers and thieves. That's not like it, but certainly this is it. That you can go on to an elevator in a hospital and hear this semi-understandable language, perhaps being used in ways that you don't understand, and they can be talking about some patient on the 12th floor or on the 17th floor. They might be talking about a patient who is being prepped for the ECU, the Eternal Care Unit. It's a euphemism for their dying. The Eternal Care Unit as opposed to the Intensive Care Unit, the ECU. It would sound like, hey, ECU must be real. Or consult pathology, an autopsy, and there's a lot of that kind of language. But that's it. That you can be listening to it and have no clue unless you are an insider. I had a lot of criticism about the book initially because it's a bit controversial and it was framed as you won't believe what doctors call you and other allied health professionals call you behind your back. Which is kind of not what the book is about, but we'll get into that. The first thing I want to say about slang or argot is that it's normal. It's normal in high pressure, high stress, high stakes, high intensity environments. So healthcare is one of them, but air traffic controllers, stock traders, people who were on currency traders, day traders, the military, astronauts, people who work in various aspects of the airline industry, and the police, firefighters, and each of them has their own slang. And this is just 3 examples of military slang. And of course, I'm going to have to be polite because this is being recorded for posterity. Greetings to Lakeshore and to Orangeville, by the way. I didn't do that before. I should do that now. I'm watching you. You're watching me. I'm watching you. I just want you to know that. Anyway, here are three, and I'll have to clean up my language. So, and these are acronymic examples of acronymic slang. So, FUBAR, fracked up beyond all repair. And then snafu, situation normal, all fracked up. Those two you've heard of. You may not have heard of bohica. Bohica is another piece of military slang. It stands for bend over, here it comes again. And you know, it's metaphorical sodomy. And that is, I mean, we're among friends, and I can speak about controversial subjects, but this is clearly somebody's, or not somebody's, but a very commonly held view of military hierarchy. And you know, the other two, FUBAR and snafu, it tells you, it speaks to a certain frustration with the fact that the best laid plans often go to waste. That bad things happen even with the best of preparation and plans. In fact, sometimes it happens all the time. The interesting thing about all three bits of slang is that all three have been used in the corridors of medicine. FUBAR, I've heard, you know, talking about a resuscitation that goes wrong, where everything that could go wrong does go wrong. Snafu, that might be a situation, that might be talking about, you know, what it's like to try to arrange for an outpatient ultrasound in a particular hospital. It always goes this way, or the record keeping, the time when you really need this record, you're not going to be able to get it, or you know, you're waiting for a beta HCG, you're waiting for a pregnancy test before you can do the imaging study, and Murphy's Law says that if that's the lab test you need the most desperately, that's the one that's going to take 4 hours to get back, and then they'll say, well, we never received the sample, and you're rolling your eyes and saying this has happened again and again. It's like a recurring nightmare. Bohica, you might think, hey, Bohica? Not in medicine? Couldn't be. Oh, yes. Yes. I interviewed urologists, and I interviewed anybody who trained in the veterinary administration system. Some of my best jokes are unconscious. The veterinary administration system. Wow. Wowie. The Veterans Administration System, the VA, which is the healthcare system for veterans, for people in the military and people who are retired from the military. They actually have Bohica clinics. And that's the nickname. Bohica Clinic is a clinic in which men with rather large prostates are invited to come to the clinic so that first-year medical students can do the appropriate examination to feel an enlarged prostate. Bohica Clinic. And so they actually, that's not metaphorical, that's literal. Okay. So borrowed slang. British slang, you know, it's interesting. I didn't have a chapter on British slang. The Brits have some of the most caustic slang that's imaginable, and some of this, you know, I'm putting this up for your sociological analysis, not because I'm endorsing it. Funny, FLK, funny looking kid, horrible slang. It's interesting. I've actually had older pediatricians that come up to me and say, well, I still use it. But it is slang for, you know, you don't write this down in a chart. That's another interesting part about slang. It's slang that's used for a child with facial appearance that appears to be consistent. It's an unknown genetic syndrome, but it looks like it might be a genetic syndrome. That's actually, that used to be written in charts. People don't write it anymore. Others, JLP, just like Papa. GLM, good looking mother. LBNH, lights on but nobody home. There's a lot of slang in the British literature for people who are somewhat intellectually challenged. Pumpkin positive. You know, one of my kids asked me, what does that mean? Well, when you hollow out the pumpkin, and then you can put a candle in it, and then the head lights up. So if you understand what I'm talking about there. PRAFTO, I'm not going to somebody actually took the time to invent that acronym. Tube, totally unnecessary breast examination. UBI, I didn't put that in, unexplained beer injury. Sunday hangover, patients with black eyes and swollen knees and no idea how they got them. And you know, I mean, these two guys didn't, Steve Coogan and John Cleese didn't invent the language, but I have to believe that the language comes from a culture with a very dry sense of humor and a very caustic sense of humor. Now, I said I was going to talk about the House of God. The House of God was published in 1978, and it was a novel that was very heavy on semi-autobiography of that man, Stephen Bergman. Although he wasn't called Stephen Bergman back then, you'll notice his name was Samuel Shem. Shem is Hebrew for name. And so that was a bit of a joke on his part. That's also an even bigger joke because he's a practicing Buddhist. Stephen Bergman did not want to be known by his name because he didn't want patients to be thinking that he was some kind of dude because he wrote a novel. Anyway, he wrote a book based on his experiences at the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. Hence, the House of God was a euphemism. So it was kind of like primary colors for healthcare. This book was, in its day, he sold 1,550 copies at a time. Then they did another print run. It took him a long time to get a publisher. Published in 1978. Sold out the first run, second run, third run, fourth run. I don't know how many printings it's up to now, but it's continuously in print since 1978, and it has sold over 2 million copies. So must be something. And I can tell you that this was the book to read if you were in medical school or in residency or early in your attending physician or surgeon career back in the very late 1970s, 1980s to the 90s. And the interesting thing about the book, to me, I mean, there are many things. Now we have more than 50% of the class of medical school classes in residency consisting of women. And I've had many women say to me, this book said nothing to me, and I got nothing to learn from this book. And I respect that, and I appreciate that. It was a very sexist novel, but it's dated. It was a book about its time. But the thing that I remembered the most was this very, very realistic slang. And those are some of the slang words that came directly from the book. Gomers, LOLs and NAD, that's little old ladies in no apparent distress. That was a species of patient admitted to hospital by marginally competent attending physicians who would just churn them through the system to do lots of tests and put them on lots of therapies to try to raise their income and not do very much to help the patient. Turfing patients. The slang had definitions. To turf a patient was to admit them to your service and then find another reason, another medical or surgical problem, in order to transfer them to another service, hence the turf. So, and this was a darkly humorous book. So they talked about Samuel Shem, his mentor, his dude. He didn't have a dude in real life, but his mentor was called the Fat Man. The Fat Man teaches him the 11 rules of the House of God. I'm going to get into Gomer in just a second. The O sign and the Q sign. This is a visual. I don't know if you have to come in on a close-up. The O sign, and a lot of the slang was devoted to very elderly patients with dementia. And we'll get into what that's all about in just a moment. But the O sign was an elderly patient with dementia lying in bed with their mouth hanging open in the sign of an O. The Q sign is a variant of the O sign in which their tongue is hanging out to form the letter Q. Darkly humorous, but also a very despairing kind of book. The turf, so they talked about, to turf a patient, the dude or the fat man would tell the hero of the book that if you wanted to turf a patient to orthopedics, you would crank up the bed so that the patient would fall out of bed and break their hip. Well, that would be an automatic turf to orthopedics. And you know, like good satire, it was a bitter pill with a sugar coating, and there was more than a grain of truth to what he had to say. The purpose of that slang was to help cope with the culture that exploited residents, and at the time they were working huge hours. And I want you to let's hear a little bit of Samuel Shem talking about this, because if I was going to do a book about slang, I wanted to trace the history of slang, which meant I had to talk to this guy. And the first question I asked him was, where did you get the slang from? Who taught you the slang?
So there wasn't a lot of terminology being used. You guys invented it.
There wasn't a lot, no. In those days there wasn't. There were others from other hospitals that we heard of a couple from other hospitals, like Sinai, I think, or NYU. NYU is Sinai, yeah. Which didn't get much traction because it was even worse than Gomer. It's a Spaz, S-H-P-O-Z, you know that? No, S-H-P-O-S. It seemed even too cruel for us, but it was New York, you know. Subhuman piece of shit. That's our reaction. We thought that was because those were about the, you know, the criminals and drug addicts and gang guys that came in to Bellevue. We didn't use that. We thought that we really thought that was too much. But there weren't too many terms, as I recall. No.
So that was a cringeworthy word for you, Spaz.
Yes, that was cringeworthy. Partly because the people it referred to were, you know, people more our age who, I mean, you can get really angry, as you know, as an emergency room doc, when an alcoholic or a drug addict, for instance, one of them, comes in and is going to die, but you know how to save him. And especially with an alcoholic, a drug addict is a little easier sometimes because you just give him some naltrexone and he'll, you know, reverse. But an alcoholic, you know it's going to take a lot of work for you, and you also think that you'll see him next week. And it makes you so angry at these people because you've spent your whole life getting trained to save people, and these people seemingly don't want to save themselves.
So you can begin to see the thing that was wonderful. You know, I visited Stephen Bergman at his house in Newton, Massachusetts. He's recently retired as a psychiatrist. Also works with a lot of people with substance abuse, and you can see he's very thoughtful and reflective on what the slang means. And very interesting thing, there was an article in which a New York psychiatrist not earlier this year, I guess, late in 2014, wrote an article in Slate about a Spaz patient. And I fell off my chair. I could not believe that I had never heard the phrase Spaz until he said it to me. And he said even back then it was outrageous that anybody would use it. But clearly there's a culture in New York that uses it. What's interesting about this is that there's been a backlash against the psychiatrist who wrote that article in which she used the word Spaz. And a lot of it has been, you know, people can write articles or write criticisms or comments to say, I disagree with you, or that's a terrible bit of language to use. It's rare to have critics trying to disqualify it by saying, you know, I've been practicing for 30 years and I've never heard this word. So they actually questioned whether it was being used or not. But that shows you that there's a very strong reaction to it. What are we talking about here? We're talking about something called the hidden curriculum. And there's a hidden curriculum in every area of academic study, and you wouldn't be surprised if I told you that there was a hidden curriculum in medicine. And Fred Hafferty, who I interviewed for my book, is another medical sociologist who has written a book. He's written many, many articles about the hidden curriculum of medicine. Basically, the hidden curriculum is the gap between what you what you learn in lectures and textbooks and what you need to know to survive in the system. You know, for instance, on the wards, you don't show up your senior resident. You can be competitive, but not cutthroat about being competitive. You don't show up your attending physician, and these are the kinds of things that you learn to survive on the wards. And part of that hidden curriculum is slang. So that was another person who legitimized slang in my eyes. So the premise here is that argot, as explained to me by Renee Fox, is a symbolic language that unpacks attitudes and emotions. And if you develop an ear for hospital slang, you can learn a lot about our worldview of patients in healthcare. That means our worldview in healthcare, and about the culture of modern medicine. And this is some of the reaction to, not the book, because they hadn't read the book, but to the publicity surrounding the book from last April. I'm a surgeon at a busy hospital in Montreal. Most of the terms exposed by Goldman I've never heard of. His book paints too many of us in a bad light. I think that was because it wasn't the book, it was the coverage. The morbid slang attributed to Canadian MDs in Goldman's book is flip, insulting, and denigrating. That it is. I don't disagree with that. This is my favorite comment. As a physician at Vancouver General Hospital, I've never heard physicians or nurses using those pejorative terms. The most likely explanation is that the article originates from Toronto. Or New York, evidently. The reality is that I interviewed hundreds of health professionals, allied health professionals, then and now and since, and I asked them for slang or stories or both, and they generously gave me both or either. And all of them had either used slang or heard it used by others in a contemporary fashion. And so what I wanted to be able to do, using the House of God as a touchstone, I wanted to be able to contemporize it. And what I discovered is that there's three categories of slang or argot. Situations that people in healthcare find distressing, annoying, or beneath us, etc., etc. Things that they don't talk about in textbooks. Attitudes that we display that they don't necessarily talk about in textbooks. There's slang, lots of slang for patient stereotypes that we don't particularly enjoy caring for. And then, not surprising to me, but maybe a bit surprising to you, slang for colleagues we don't like or respect, or sometimes worse. So let's talk about situations first of all. You've heard of Code Blue, which I guess could have been argot at one point, jargon, certainly jargon. Then it entered the vernacular, when shows like Scrubs popularized it. So it's a cardiac arrest procedure. You drop everything and run to the scene. Code Red, that's a fire emergency in the hospital. Code Orange, some of these vary. They aren't all universalized. Code Orange may refer to a situation in which there are no beds in the hospital, and it's kind of crisis management, and what you have to do is redirect ambulances to other hospitals and begin to work on this on early discharge of patients, go through the hospital and decide who can go home as quickly as possible. Code Black, disasters. So what do you think Code Brown stands for? A poop emergency, yes. And there's a serious side to Code Brown, and I know I don't want to make you too queasy, but I think a story here is in order. That's Erin Sullivan. Erin Sullivan was a registered nurse at one point and is now finishing up her residency in family medicine, family and community medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. And she and I talked about Code Brown stories, and I want you to think about who has the Code Brown stories. Who has the stories to tell? Because that's really what this is about.
Who uses the phrase Code Brown more, doctors or nurses?
Definitely nurses. They're the ones dealing with the Code Browns, in fairness. So, yeah.
So tell me the first time you heard Code Brown. Do you think you heard the Code Brown used, or the most egregious Code Brown you can think of?
Well, I have a couple of egregious Code Browns that come to mind. I can't think of the first time, because it was like
Doesn't matter.
years ago. You want examples?
Oh, yes.
Oh, dear Lord. Okay. I would say the worst one was a patient who was morbidly obese and very immobile. Couldn't move at all, even from side to side. And he just had basically a constant diarrhea. I mean, it was unrelenting, and I was on. It was at nighttime. There was only one other nurse in the department, and so it was my job the entire 12-hour shift basically to just try and turn him as much as I could, pull the sheet out, put a new sheet down, turn him on the other side, pull the old sheet out, pull the new one across, and then the process would just start over again.
So you said he was obese. How much did he weigh? Can you estimate? I mean, nurses are really good at estimating weights.
He was about 400 pounds. Yeah.
So
morbidly obese. Morbidly obese.
It was just you?
It was just me, yes, and one other nurse who wasn't the most helpful RN on the planet, shall we say.
How the hell did you do it?
A lot of sweating and cussing, mostly, to be honest. I mean, it was horrendous. It was one of those nights where I actually almost just quit my job and walked out of the department. Like, it was just like, what is happening here? This is just not on.
And, it's, I've certainly, there's a patient there, and I've never met a patient who wants to be incontinent. So it's important to keep that in mind. But at the same time, it's not either or. Patients allowed to have feelings, and health professionals aren't supposed to have feelings. I have a thing about that. I think you either you either talk about it or you stuff it. And if you stuff it, then you might be dealing with it by drinking alcohol or by having fights with your loved ones because you've just got no place to put it. So I think there has to be a place for it, but you might disagree. There's a lot of slang. This is polite slang. It's called social injuries of the rectum, and it's actually jargon because how do you talk about it? How do you talk about it? Well, here's a guy who's willing to talk about it, Mark Bernstein, who's a colorectal surgeon at St. Michael's Hospital.
There's an area that we refer to as social injuries of the rectum, and this includes foreign bodies and other traumas to the anorectal region. It's certainly not our business to be judgmental. It's our business to help patients. But you can imagine that sometimes we see some pretty unusual things in my specialty.
Like what?
Gee, are you interested in a list?
Oh, I think one or two.
Well, zucchini and the cucumber are certainly on the hit list. We've seen everything from deodorant spray bottles to vases, similar objects. One of my favorite stories in this area is when a young man had to have a zucchini removed from the rectum. My senior resident, I was a junior resident at the time, and my senior resident and I left the operating room. I think we were not expecting to run into the young man's mother, who we ran into in the lounge outside the operating room, and she said to my senior, what was it? And my senior resident said it was a bowel obstruction, not really prepared to give the whole story. He hadn't thought this through. Said it was a bowel obstruction. And she said, I knew it was something he ate.
I don't know if they're laughing in Orangeville. You're busted. You laughed. So why do we laugh? We laugh because it permits us to express indirectly our own personal feelings, either at the patient's lifestyle or what we have to do to fix them. Not so funny when it's not a zucchini and instead it's a fluorescent light bulb that shatters. True story. Surgeon had to fix it, took 11 operations to fix that, to fix the patient. And in addition to that, it's part of the bond. It gives us a polite means to share with others, and it reinforces that bond. Here's another kind of situation about which we have a lot of slang. We have synonyms for patients who are dying, entering the drain, circling the drain. So the difference between the two: circling the drain, it's inevitable; entering the drain, they're teetering. And often these are often patients in critical care in the intensive care unit, where you don't know how it's going. You have your spidey sense tells you this may not go well. But, it's going to take a day or two to know for sure. And they have a saying in the intensive care unit that if you're not getting better, by definition, you're getting worse. You can't stay the same. If you stay the same, you're not getting better. And if you're not getting better, then at some point it becomes inevitable that you're going to die. Others, hanging crepe. Where do you hang crepe? At funerals. Well, quaint custom, but you understand what I mean. Discharged up. Discharged to heaven. PBAD, pine box at door. PBADLO, pine box at door, lid open. Croaked, crumped, transferred to pathology, the eternal care unit. Admitted to the 19th floor of a hospital with 18 floors. There are cute and clever ways of dealing with it. And why do we have it? We have it because, well, first of all, in the case of Code Brown, nobody told us until it actually happened that we'd have to be cleaning this up. And when you look around you, it's sometimes your mentors are acting as if nothing happened, as if it's nothing, as if it has no instinctive gut feeling inside you. With death, it's very similar. That there are weighty tomes about dealing with patients who are at or near the end of life, but very, very little is written about the emotional impact, and until quite recently. And so the language becomes a way of venting that feeling, reflecting upon it. Circling the drain is a very interesting bit of language, and I had the privilege a few years back of hearing a number of residents, Rick Mon, Noreen Polpat, Clarissa Burke, Andrew Burke, and Gaurav Puri, talking about circling the drain and euphemisms for death and why they use it.
what you described, I think, is what we all agree, and it's sort of understood, and circling the drain is a way to say that in 3 words. You know, as we were talking about this, and this is somewhat on a tangent, but you asked about other euphemisms that came up, and the one that has always stuck with me, unfortunately, for whatever reason, is a staff who colloquially used to say to patients, or about patients, tell them not to buy any green bananas, in the sense that they weren't going to be around to see them go ripe.
You're shaking your head. Why?
It just seems a little bit insensitive.
Who has a story of the first time that they recognized that a patient was circling the drain?
The patient that comes to mind when you said that was actually my first experience as a medical student with a patient who was dying. I think that maybe a lot of us feel like that very first patient is somebody who sticks with us because it's the first time that we face ourselves as, medical caregivers who aren't working towards fixing the problem, saving the life, fighting to the bitter end. I think it's the first time that I had to take a step back and make a change towards thinking about how I could help that person come to their end in as dignified way as possible. It was a very nice lady who had come in with breast cancer that had metastasized. She'd had probably a year of back pain leading up to it, and then came to the hospital in an absolute crisis of pain. And that was the point at which we made the diagnosis and had to tell her that this was not something that we could cure, that we could treat, that would be, gotten rid of. And that discussion, I participated in it, and I was there, but I think that as the patient was coming to the understanding of what was happening, I think I was also coming to that understanding. And it was, I think, a very hard road to travel down.
So you decide, whether switching to comfort measures is a better way of putting it. I think circling the drain actually adds an emotional layer that actually speaks to what the patient, to what the health care providers are experiencing at that moment. As they switch from, we're going to try to save this person, to, we've failed. How do you deal with that? And the language, I would submit to you, helps them to deal with that. And again, some people may disagree. There's slang about distressing situations, other kinds of distressing situations. Horrendomas, horrendoplasties. So a horrendoma is a horrible situation. And notice oma is a suffix for a tumor, a mass. So horrendous becomes horrendoma. That's a patient who has a horrible situation. A horrendoplasty is the surgical version. We go into the operating room, and the FUBAR operation is sometimes called a horrendoplasty. Then there's something called peek and shriek. Peek and shriek is slang that's still used today for opening up the belly, in the expectation that you're going to remove a tumor and finding that the belly's riddled with cancer, and you quietly close it up. And it speaks to a level of frustration, especially if you didn't know, if you're shocked. And I had a story in the secret language that was told to me by Raz Mula, an OBGYN who remembered during his residency days taking a team of physicians taking a woman in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy to the operating room because she had this vague abdominal pain, and because she had because she was pregnant, you couldn't do a CT scan because you'd irradiate the baby. And they opened up the belly. They did an ultrasound. It was equivocal. They were able to get some information. They finally decided we better take her to the operating room, and they did. And they found that she had metastatic cancer, and there was no emotional preparation for that moment because you think of pregnancy, and this is the dawn of hope. Our hope for the world, our hopes and dreams are with the next generation. And here was a woman who was dying as she was carrying this baby, close to, but not at the end of term. And so this language helps physicians, surgeons deal with the emotional impact of that kind of situation. And it's interesting because, it speaks to the issue of what we're supposed to do with emotions. And I know there's a lot of students who are in the audience who are going to be healthcare providers. And I can tell you that that the original teaching from Sir William Osler was that we were supposed to exhibit something called detached concern, and be concerned but be emotionally completely detached from what we see. And that comes from an essay that Osler wrote called Equanimitas. It was his farewell address to the University of Pennsylvania, and this is a quote: "Imperturbability means," and that was a phrase that I heard again and again in med school, that we should be imperturbable, that it means coolness and presence of mind under all circumstances, calmness and amid storm, clearness of judgment in moments of grave peril, immobility, impassiveness. Basically, never let them see you sweat. Now, fast forward to 2003, when a psychiatrist and philosopher named Jody Halpern wrote this article in the Journal of General Internal Medicine, that doctors strive for detachment to reliably care for all patients, regardless of their personal feelings, yet patients want genuine empathy from doctors, and doctors want to provide it. Well, some do. Not all of us do. So you can see the tension between, the risk of getting too emotionally involved, but at the same time, if you're so detached, then that you're ignoring the suffering of the patients around you. Well, I don't believe you can. I think what happens is that you bottle it up inside, and it rages inside you. And that's why I think there's a lot of my colleagues, 40, 50-something, who've got that look of weariness on their face that they've never been able to vent their feelings. The delight's gone from their eyes. Let's switch over from situations to slang for patients that we find frustrating. Frequent flyers. I've heard worse. Cockroaches and crocs, which are awful terms. And in preparation for the book, I actually heard people tell me stories in which they use those terms. Frequent flyer is neutral, but it's pejorative at the same time. And it's interesting because people said to me, I've been practicing for 30 years and I've never heard this slang. And my comebacker would be, well, have you heard the phrase frequent flyer? And they'd say, oh yeah, you do realize that's slang. And it's ironic slang because, in the airline industry, a frequent flyer is a beloved customer. But in medicine, in a publicly funded system, you're wasting valuable resources, or maybe you want booties, or maybe you want a free meal, or a taxi chit, or a TTC token, or you're trying to jump the queue, jump the system. There's a lot of that us and them. There is a hero, and in every one of my chapters, and I had one called Frequent Flyers, I have a hero, and Jeff Brenner is my hero. He doesn't call them frequent flyers, he calls them super utilizers. And I don't know if I have a slide of him. No. He has, do I? No. Maybe I do. Okay. Jeff Brenner has made a study of people who utilize hospitals, who go back again and again. And his database comes from the city of Camden, New Jersey, one of the highest crime rates in the United States. And he went looking for criminal hotspots because he was very perturbed about the death of a man named Hiram Ross, who's a young man who was accused of being a drug dealer and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, was shot by police. He was, in fact, a student at Rutgers on a scholarship, and he was snuffed out. And this guy he's a physician. He was so frustrated, he went to the police looking for criminal hotspots, and what he found instead were medical hotspots. Places, whole apartment buildings that have super utilizers, filled with people who go to the emergency department or the hospital again and again, 300 times in a 4-year period. Some outrageous number like that. Well, he's been able to, by finding where the super utilizers are, he's actually able to find out why they keep going back to the hospital again and again and fix the problem. And if I have time at the end, I'll tell you what he's doing about that. But what does it say about us that we would label a patient? What does it say about the culture of medicine that we would label patients who return again and again for treatment? Well, on a gut psychological level, healthcare professionals, if somebody keeps coming back, it means we must have failed them. And who likes to have failure, confronting their failures again and again? Or, maybe it's a frustration that I've tried my best with you and I can't, and I don't know what more I can offer. I don't know how to rethink this problem. They make the mistake of seeing return visit as emblematic of failure. It may not be failure. It may be that they've got no other place to go, no better place to go to receive the care that they need. Futility. That if you keep coming back and I keep offering you the same treatment, that's futile. And we have a thing about futility in healthcare. Some see super utilizers, as I said, looking for favors from the system, like booties and taxi chits and that kind of thing. But there's a problem with this whole kind of mal-analysis of frequent flyers. The fact is that we could all be frequent flyers because we are on the cusp of an epidemic of diabetes and high blood pressure and lung disease and cancer and kidney disease and heart failure and mental health issues and musculoskeletal problems, and you add all of them up and they cost 75 cents out of every healthcare dollar that's spent. Trouble is, we're all trained to put in chest tubes and defibrillate hearts and take out cancers, which is all good, all important. But increasingly, we're dealing with this, and we're not prepared for that at all. And even worse, we think, we know that there are three common denominators to most of those chronic diseases, and they are too much food, too much the wrong kind of food, or not enough exercise, too much smoking, and too much alcohol and other drugs. And this is a very interesting thing. I'm going a little bit off script for just a second because I'm talking about the culture of medicine, but if there is one common denominator that I think is really intriguing, it comes from a study that was paid for by the Centers for Disease Control in the United States in Atlanta. It's called the ACES study, ACES, it's an acronym, but look it up, take a look at it, because the common denominator, if you see patients who eat too much, smoke too much, or drink too much, or a combination of all three, there's a good chance that they have one particular risk factor in common: early childhood trauma. Physical, emotional, God forbid, sexual, or some combination. What we do with that information, I don't know yet, but it's a really important one to keep in the back of your mind. Back to Jeff Brenner. Jeff Brenner in Camden, New Jersey, went looking for crime hotspots and actually found apartment buildings where many of the residents show up again and again in the emergency department. And I don't think I have time to show you this, but this was the subject of a Frontline documentary that was hosted by Atul Gawande, who wrote the book Being Mortal. And it's worth keeping in mind that this is a guy who has actually taken something that most of us in the culture of medicine simply find frustrating and set out to do something about it, which I think is really, really interesting. It's a total 180-degree paradigm shift. And there are Canadian examples of medical hotspots. Hamilton, Ontario, the Hamilton Spectator did a series in conjunction with McMaster University called Code Red. And what they did was they mapped out the places where there are high utilizers of healthcare and low utilizers of healthcare. And what they discovered were massive differences between Hamilton's 130 neighborhoods. One inner city block cost $2,000 per person in hospital, ER, and ambulance costs over a 2-year period. During the same period of time, one well-heeled rural neighborhood, just $138 a person. That's what, an 8-fold or more, 15, 13-fold difference in cost. So really a huge difference. No, it's closer to an 8-fold. Here's another bit of slang that I didn't talk about yet, Gomer. It's historical slang. It was popularized on shows like Scrubs, and so nobody uses it anymore, but back in the House of God, it was defined as a patient who's frequently admitted with complicated but uninspiring and incurable conditions. Incurable is the operative word. It's an acronym, and in the House of God, Samuel Shem said that it stood for Get Out of My Emergency Room. That was an East Coast derivation. There's actually a West Coast derivation, Grand Old Man of the ER. And then there's a third derivation, which I think is more likely to be the truest, and that is this guy, who you don't know in the bottom right. I do. That's a 1960s sitcom called Gomer Pyle. But if you want to know who Gomer was, just think of him as the grandfather of Forrest Gump. Somebody who is not worldly wise, but has an instinctive, intuitive ability to get along with people, but at the same time is not really book wise or book smart. What that has to do with elderly patients with dementia is beyond me. But if you actually do a search of the etymology of the word Gomer, in reference to patients, they refer to the Gomeral simpleton, whatever that means. Anyway, that's what it is. On the other hand, nobody uses Gomer, but they use other slang. Today, we will refer to patients as social admissions. That means that They have no medical problem that I can fix. Dialysis for kidney failure, chest tube for pneumothorax, thrombolytic therapy for heart attacks or strokes, but I can't send them home. And you know, social admission suggests that if that patient's admitted to the internal medicine service, I'm not at all, if I'm the internist, I'm not interested in that patient at all. They're taking up space. They're a bed blocker. That's another bit of slang. Failure to cope is another one that's used in part of this lexicon. You know, they can't cope with the vagaries of life. They can't organize their life. Some of them make it to a more witty form, like dyscopia. Dys is a prefix for difficulty, so dysuria, difficulty voiding, dyspnea, difficulty breathing. Difficulty coping becomes dyscopia, and hypocopia. The most egregious bit of slang that I heard in my search was told to me by this guy, Donovan Gray, who wrote the book, Dude, Where's My Stethoscope? And he doesn't use it, he said. They all say that, by the way. You never heard this from me. FTD, which is not the florist that went belly up some time ago. It is 3 letters that stand for failure to die. Wow is right. So there's a suggestion that the patient should have died a long time ago but didn't get the memo. Part of this is I think it's fair to say that young health professionals, until very recently, were not well trained, weren't given the right equipment, particularly weren't well trained in geriatrics. At the same time, I think we still are not attracting people into health professions who adore working with older Canadians, which I think is sad because that's where we're heading. And that's, if I could wave my magic wand, I would say you have to love elderly patients. If you don't love elderly patients, you can't be a physician or a nurse or a licensed practical nurse or a respiratory therapist or what have you. I want you to hear this bit of tape because this may make you a bit angry. This is the 4 who were interviewed in this clip won't make you angry. They're wonderful. Nathan Stahl, Amanda Gardhouse, Raza Nakvi, and Gillian Elston. 4 young physicians who early on decided they wanted to become geriatricians. And then they went to their colleagues who reacted when they gave them the news that they were going to go into geriatrics. Have a listen.
When I committed to geriatrics, the reaction that I got from my peers and from my staff and from even some of my mentors at my medical school was overwhelmingly negative. I was told that I was wasting my talents, that I was too smart to be doing something like that, and how could I pick a specialty where I wasn't actually helping people? This really bothered me. There is, I believe, a culture of ageism in medicine.
Amanda, you were nodding as he spoke.
I think we all share Nathan's frustrations in that geriatrics is perceived as a very negative subspecialty.
Rasa, do you agree with what you've just heard?
So I think absolutely. I think my kind of stumbling upon geriatrics is very different than a lot of my colleagues. I ended up filling in a block with geriatrics just to get it done, and because I just had a daughter and I needed some time. So geriatrics is light and you don't do much, was the reputation. I came on and I loved it, and as soon as I started telling people I actually liked it, I found myself defending myself a lot. And we need to try to get rid of that stigma that's so closely attached, I think.
Jillian, do you agree?
For the most part, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's not a respected career choice. I think just the reaction that I get is, well, I'm glad somebody wants to do it. Or, good for you, I would kill myself if I had to do that.
Wow, I'd kill myself if I had to be a geriatrician.
No, but I think I've actually probably heard that, or like I would gouge my eyeballs out if I had to spend an hour with a patient every time I saw them.
Amazing. Now, some of that is ageism, right? Because we are in a culture that's ageist. And, you have to get to a certain age when people start to call you, ma'am or sir, and just think that whatever you know is irrelevant. And would we expect health professionals to not come from the culture that gave birth to them? Part of it, though, is medical futility, which is really talking about 2 concepts. One concept is, and you'll see this sprinkled through the medical literature, medical futility means offering life-prolonging treatments without hope of success or hope of bringing somebody back to a reasonable quality of life. Who gets to judge that? Very interesting, very subjective. So there isn't a good objective definition for medical futility. The other aspect of medical futility is what I got to treat you isn't going to help you. Okay, so that's not that it's futile to the patient. It's that it's futile for me to be treating you because I lack the training and experience. And there's an easy fix for that. That means recruit people into health professions who actually have the psychological mindset, who want to be able to use that talent and want to be able to make a difference in the lives of seniors. So there's two aspects to that futility, but that futility manifests itself in many different ways. One of them is this is slang, getting the DNR. The slang, other synonyms, making the sale, closing the deal. It's the pressure that families will be put under to sign the do not resuscitate order. More recently, it's been called do not attempt resuscitation, or AND, allow natural death. And why do we put families under pressure to sign a DNR? Because unless they sign it, the default is that if their loved one's heart stops, we have to do a full code. And yes, sometimes that full code is futile. And why do we have to do it? Because it became the default option thanks to some seminal cases. One of them was the case of Karen Ann Quinlan, a young woman who died of an overdose of alcohol and drugs. Well, she slipped into a coma. She was placed on a ventilator by her doctors. This was an American case in the 70s. And ironically, it was her parents who wanted to take her off the ventilator so that she could die a natural death, but the doctors fought her. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the United States, and the judgment was doctors can't make this decision without taking into account the wishes of patients. So that turned into mandatory resuscitation unless you can get patients to say no, we don't want that. The problem with resuscitation is that television has TV dramas like ER and Grey's, more recently have been more realistic, but in the past gave people a sense that a lot of people survive. It's a chance at life, when in fact there may be no chance at all. And in fact, the statistics show that as few as 3% of people over a certain age are actually going to make it out of hospital alive. And part of the problem here is that we really haven't been talking about what it means to die and what it means to be at the end of life, and that's what we need to do. So the slang is all about trying to get around this weird transaction that has to take place. Now, some of us don't do the transaction, or we have a family that wants a full code, but we don't think it's appropriate. So we're going to run another bit of slang, something called a slow code, which is walking instead of running to the site of the cardiac arrest, being slow to order drugs, being slow to order treatment, slow to defibrillate, slow to start compressions. And what you're doing is you're waiting until you reach a certain point in time when you can safely say this patient has to have irreversible brain damage, and so you can call the code. Now, this is deception. It should never be done, but this even exists as an indication of some of the exasperation that's felt within the corridors of medicine. Interesting, because bioethicists are beginning to formulate a notion that all of us, not just health professionals, but everybody in society has to think about what we want at the end of life. And that we may have, as patients and family members, an ethical duty to refuse treatment that's futile, because we're in a lifeboat. And we can't afford to have everybody one at a time receiving maximum treatment if it is futile. I can tell you that physicians know and care, and all health providers, certainly nurses as much as physicians, respiratory therapists, and others who see a lot of seniors at the end of life, know that the system spends more in the last 2 years of a patient's life than all the other years combined. I've certainly seen that up close with my own parents. And that patients and families are often not aware of this and act as if it's somebody else's problem. And bioethicists are suggesting it's everybody's problem, and I think that's very interesting. But the point is that if you're doing resuscitations on people who you think, not that they don't deserve it, but that it's futile, that this is a patient for whom resuscitation was never intended, somebody with multiple comorbidities, somebody who has cancer, chronic kidney disease, chronic diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic congestive heart failure, and we're pushing on their chest and sometimes cracking their ribs. And when that happens, you experience something called moral distress, which is the stress that occurs when you know or believe that you know the right course of action, but rules keep you from doing that course of action. So you do what your heart says you shouldn't do, and it eats you up inside. And this was first described as a risk factor for burnout among nurses, and but can be seen across all healthcare professionals, particularly people who have to do full code resuscitations where they think it's utterly futile. And burnout is a stress syndrome characterized by three things: emotional exhaustion, decreased satisfaction at work, distancing yourself from patients and coworkers, and really astonishing percentages of health professionals, particularly young people these days, experience one or more of the symptoms of burnout. Deb Lowe is a nurse who recently graduated from the University of Victoria. She was an ICU nurse, and then she suffered from burnout. And I want you to hear her talking about this, because some of the slang is a cover for this.
I feel less involved sometimes when I'm there.
What does that
because
mean?
I'm somebody that really likes to keep current with my practice. I go to a lot of conferences, I do a lot of reading, and I have a notebook that I update constantly. I've been doing less of that.
Aside from that sense of commitment, do you think it's affected your day-to-day work in other ways?
I'm probably, with my colleagues, I'm probably a little less sunny at work, I would say. Yeah, I have less enthusiasm for the work. I complain a lot more than I used to, which I don't like in myself. And I look at things in a negative light when that's not necessarily the way they are. I feel like I don't give people the benefit of a doubt as often as I used to. And I have a harder time seeing things from other people's point of view. So yeah, I think it's sort of, I've cast a bit of a pall over my practice, which is my burnout, which isn't necessarily the way things are.
Are you exceptional when it comes to burnout, or are you typical?
I think I'm pretty typical, Brian, unfortunately. Where I work, there's a lot of talk of what we're going to do next after we're done nurses.
You and your colleagues?
Done being nursing, yeah. A lot of people are leaving. A lot of people my age have been practicing for about 4 or 5 years. You know, there's a lot of talk of what we're going to do when we win the lottery.
Interestingly, she didn't quit. She became a nurse practitioner, and now she's happy. And that's important. You take control of your life. All too many people stay in the same job for too long when the little voice inside them is saying that they should move on. Don't have time to talk about that. There's slang, modern slang for bariatric patients, and we have large numbers of them. Harpooning the whale. That is actual slang for putting an epidural catheter in a bariatric or a dangerously obese patient in the second stage of labor. The harpoon is the large TUI epidural catheter. Epidural catheter needle, that is. Whales, seals, fluffy. Trope that I discovered in the United States, 1 plus, 2 plus, 3 plus. Each plus is 200 pounds, so if somebody is 4 plus Chicago or 4 plus Chicago is 800 pounds. 3 plus Midwest is 600 pounds. They'll talk about Beamer patients, patients who are BMI, that means a high body mass index. The big gut is called a Milwaukee goiter or a Bojangleoma. Why? It's, again, a bit of salty humor. Bojangleoma. Like oma is, of course, a suffix for tumor. Bojangles is a famous restaurant chain that serves fried chicken and biscuits and sweet tea. So the assumption is that if you go to Bojangles a little too often, you'll develop a Bojangleoma. Where's that coming from? Well, part of it is the frustration. If you are a paramedic, for instance, and you have to bring somebody who weighs 400 or 500 pounds down 4 flights of stairs, you better have a bariatric stretcher, or you're going to be in trouble. And you know, the capital cost of bariatric stretchers and bariatric ambulances is prohibitive. But it's necessary if you've got that patient population. You can see a bariatric wheelchair, bariatric lift, bariatric stretchers, bariatric operating room tables. You better have the equipment and you better have the time to look after these patients. Why? Because if you're a surgeon and you're taking out their appendix, it will take twice as long. It'll be without the proper equipment to move that gut to the side, and you have to cauterize all the way down. You need special equipment to hold it out of the way so that you can actually find the appendix and take it out. And oh, by the way, it takes twice as long to take the appendix out, and the patient will get a wound infection. They'll remain in hospital twice as long, and they're almost certain to be readmitted 6 weeks down the road. So there is real frustration. Well, what's the common thread to all the slang? Frequent flyers, Gomers, bariatric patients, mental health patients, there's slang for them, substance abuse patients, indigent, homeless patients. Their numbers are growing. We lack the special expertise and training, and in fact, the right kind of people have not been attracted to health professions until very recently, and so we don't like having them as patients. because we were never geared to having them as patients. Now that's clearly something that needs to change. How nice are we to each other? Well, you'd be happy to know even worse. Emergency physicians like me referred to as referrologists because all I do is refer. Triage monkey is a horrible insult because it's insulting the health professionals about whom I have the greatest respect, and that is triage nurses who decide, who see this onslaught and sort them, which is what what triage is all about, sorting patients into, you go in now, you can wait 2 hours, you can wait 90 minutes, and oh, by the way, the ones who are sent to a chair in the waiting room, well, they have to keep reassessing them to make sure they don't turn into somebody who better come in right now, because you never know when it's going to be a ruptured appendix or a ruptured ectopic pregnancy, even worse. So calling me, well, a triage monkey, not only insults me, but really insults triage nurses. Doctor, a nurse practitioner or a clinical nurse specialist who thinks he or she is a doctor. Midwife, a midwife who thinks he or she is an obstetrician gynecologist, or a midwife who so that criticism could be coming from nurses, from labor and delivery nurses, or it could be coming from fellow midwives. If they call a colleague a midwife, what they're saying is that midwife isn't a member of the tribe, a member of the club. They subscribe too much to the medical model of labor and delivery. They fit too well in the system, whereas they should be advocating for home births, so we're going to call them a midwife. More British slang. Jack Bauer, a physician still up and working for more than 24 hours. Blade is a surgeon, dashing, bold, arrogant, often wrong but never in doubt. And 00 Doc, a very bad MD with a license to kill. You see, we're slang for each other. And here's another bit of slang, blame storming, doling out blame for mistakes usually to the lowest healthcare professional in the hierarchy. And that reminds me, because I said I was going to talk about medical errors, like where does slang like that come from? We have a lot of errors. This is an underestimate, up to 24,000 deaths per year due to preventable harm, preventable medical errors at Canadian hospitals. It's probably double that or more. What's really interesting is that 7 out of 10 nurses and 8 out of 10 hospital administrators say that patients are likely to have serious errors while in hospital. The problem is the culture of medicine. And in the culture of medicine, we assume that everybody, once they're trained, never makes a mistake. Now, intellectually we know that's not true. But, we assume that everybody bats 1,000. And so the assumption is that no one ever makes a mistake, so mistakes are a red flag they could be a red flag for incompetence. If you make one mistake, we'll call that a lapse. Maybe a lapse of attention, maybe you're retired. We'll make an excuse. But, if you've ever wondered, how, would healthcare professionals be happy about revealing a second mistake 3 weeks after the first one? Oh, no, because that speaks to that. That's incompetence. And it's interesting, this is such a pervasive assumption that has ramifications. Why spend lots of money detecting errors if nobody's supposed to make errors? You don't have to, because everybody's perfect. Now, how you bat 1,000 is the health professional's problem. Errors in medical culture are either due to a momentary lapse or laziness or a pervasive pattern. Take your pick. And that's why people don't want to discuss a second error all that quickly. The problem, so what's the blame storming, what's the slang all about? Well, if nobody makes errors, then you better find somebody to blame when there's an evident bad outcome that occurs. That might be the feeling amongst most health professionals. If you're the leader of the hospital, you may feel a great deal of pressure to show that the hospital is basically sound and error-free, but for the occasional lapses by these error-filled human beings. So what will happen is that you will find somebody to blame quickly so that you can say, we conducted an investigation, and what we have now is we found what we can blame for this. And it's kind of an unhealthy attitude. It's an unhealthy attitude that I would submit to you comes from shame. On a personal level, healthcare professionals feel very uncomfortable talking or hearing about mistakes, and it's not just our own shame about our own mistakes, but vicarious shame. If I know that somebody's taken off the wrong leg in a hospital, I might have difficulty making eye contact with them. And I don't know, maybe on a gut instinctive level, I'm afraid that if I look at them, I'm going to be admitting that I'm like them. And if I'm like them, what does that say about me? And so we are really, really, really uncomfortable with errors. Now, we come to the conclusion of this talk. And what are we going to do with the slang? I've revealed a whole bunch of slang. There's a whole bunch of other terms that I didn't get to talk about, and I've talked about some of the culture that unpacks it. Well, in the culture of medicine, we have this thing called medical professionalism, and it's an outgrowth of something that started to happen in the 1980s. You know, we had this kind of romanticized version of the physician who will work any number of hours and have any number of nights on call, the family doctor who's there from cradle to grave, who gave birth to you and is there when you die, and holds your hand in the middle of the night. And you know, first of all, that's not particularly healthy, but by the same token, a lot of those physicians were replaced by healthcare conglomerates in the United States, the corporatization of medicine, and there was this belief that a lot of what, you know, that nostalgia for what we used to be, that somehow it was lost through the corporatization. And at that time, the late 80s and early 1990s, we began to see experts in medical professionalism articulating some of the views that we used to believe in intuitively. For instance, you know, you should always show respect for patients. You should never let them see you sweat. You should show respect for allied health professionals. So there are actually signs in hospitals that say slang shouldn't be uttered. And there are actually policies that articulate you shouldn't be using slang that's disrespectful. And I endorse that. I don't think you should ever be disrespectful of patients. So one view would be slang is unprofessional. If you hear it, call them into the office, read them the riot act, get rid of it. There's a problem with that. If you do that, I think you're just going to drive it underground. So in the same way that nobody writes FLK for funny looking kid on a chart, that doesn't stop them from going psst and turning it into an oral underground language. After all, the hidden curriculum is, the concept of a hidden curriculum is there for a reason. The opposite view, and I had a number of people in my book that talked about it, is that slang is healthy. It provides a way of expressing yourself emotionally, expressing strong feelings instead of stuffing them. So instead of getting rid of it, they would say encourage it. I'm a Canadian, so I'm in the middle. I don't see slang as the problem. I think slang is symbolic language. Now, it may be a symptom of disrespect, the tendency to objectify and stereotype patients. And that's a problem, because if you're blaming somebody from coming back to the hospital again and again by labeling them a frequent flyer, you may be missing the fact that they have no better place to go. Okay? So I'm against that. On the other hand, frequent flyer becomes a clue that maybe if we have a group of patients who are coming back again and again, maybe we can capture some data about them. And Jeffrey Brenner did that. He identified the frequent flyers. He calls them superutilizers. So he jargonized it. So instead of slang, the people who come back again and again to the hospital, and what he did was he took some seed money and captured them. When they were admitted to hospital, he had a team that interviewed them. When they were going home, the team escorted them home, made sure that on the way home they went to the pharmacy to bring their prescription, to get their prescriptions, because very often they didn't take their meds, made sure they got their meds, made sure they got their follow-up visits, because it's often the lack of follow-up or the lack of compliance with meds that led them to going back to the hospital again and again. In addition, he did something devilishly clever. If a ton of patients who keep coming back again and again are living in this apartment building, what if we built a clinic on the main floor of this apartment building? And he did. And what happened was that he found them a better place to go, and they stopped going to the emergency department and being readmitted to hospital. Now, I would maintain to you that if the slang helps us call attention to a problem, then it's a good thing. If slang tells us, if there's a lot of slang about bariatric patients, there's a good chance that there isn't enough equipment, bariatric stretchers and Hoyer lifts, etc. So if they're saying we need better equipment, I'd want to hear that. I don't want people to just mutter under their breaths. Or, worse yet, do an improper lift and blow out a disc in their neck. And that's a true story. That actually happened because they didn't have the proper equipment for lifts. So I think that I would listen to it, find out who's using it and why, and if the slang is a symbol that the patient, that healthcare professionals are feeling frustrated, that they don't have a place to vent their feelings, then for God's sakes, we need to give them a place to vent their feelings. That's all I wanted to say to you. Any questions? Oh, yeah, into the microphone.
So I want to thank you for the talk. And I had a question for you. There's a really good article by Hassan Shafir who talked about cloak of competence in medical school. So I don't know whether you looked into medical students and the language that they use there.
Yes.
But they were talking about how medical students are taught, not maybe slang, but they're taught how what may be more important in medical school is to portray a cloak of competence rather than actual competence, so that in front of their peers and in front of their supervisors, they can demonstrate that they know the answer to the question that they're asking.
Yes.
And they need to speak in a certain way. So I just wanted to.
That's
get
an
your
interesting
impressions.
observation. Yes, I am familiar with that work. You can have both. So you have the cloak of competence, and that's what you exhibit when you think that you're being monitored, being observed, either by patients and their families or by a mentor, seeing that you are talking the talk of a health professional. You sound as if you belong. In fact, there are cultures of when a group of surgeons is deciding whether to accept somebody in their midst, they want to know if they talk like them. So this is a way of showing that you belong. So it reinforces that bond. You can have that talk and a whole separate talk that won't appear in that article that you're referring to, and that consists of the argot or slang. Mm-hmm. And what I found is that some cultures are more apt to use slang than others. Paramedics use it. Emergency physicians use it. I think surgeons use it in a lot of cultures. You have anesthesiologists in some cultures using it to talk about surgeons to talk about anesthesiologists. But there are also cultures that I would describe as healthier cultures where they don't feel the need to use that kind of language. And I think the common denominator is that people who don't feel the need to use slang feel emotionally validated in their work and also have an ability to empathize with their patients and their colleagues. And the empathy gap is a huge one in healthcare. And I think some of that has to do with the stresses that health professionals are under.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to talk a little bit about errors, medication or non-medication errors, and I guess there's a difference between slang and euphemisms, and I wondered if you could talk to that a little bit.
Sure. So by euphemisms, you may be talking about complications, unfortunate outcomes, and it's interesting. Medication errors are one of the top causes of errors, preventable harm in healthcare. And research shows that anywhere from, it's roughly, depending on the jurisdiction, the type of healthcare system, roughly 10%. That's the potential. 10% of medications are in error, either the wrong dose given to the wrong patient, maybe it was mixed, if it's chemo mixed in the wrong way, wrong dosage interval, wrong route of administration. Very few of them end up causing egregious harm. For instance, the example that I think of in my mind, the one that puts it into focus is the patient who received 4 days of chemotherapy in 4 hours. This was at the Cross Cancer Clinic in Alberta, and that patient died of a massive overdose of chemotherapy. And that was caused by a programming error, like an error in programming an infusion pump. The fact is that in a complex system, one in which knowledge is doubling every 10 years or 5 to 10 years, whatever it is, 3 years, whatever, that we have more and more medications than we've ever had before, and it is almost impossible to have any one person be in command of all the knowledge regarding the full pharmacopoeia of medications. You have to have a system, and so humans being humans in a complex system, errors will take place. There are cognitive errors that are made. You might have a system where a nurse is mixing a particular type of medication and is relying on a colleague who's watching the nurse do the mixing to make sure that everything is being done correctly. There's evidence from cognitive psychology to show that the second nurse who's doing the observing, if they know them, if they're standing beside them, their mind might start to wander. They're thinking, I trust this person, they know what they're doing. And so they're not paying attention. They're not paying attention to what's happening. It shows you how complex it is. And, it would be tempting to say that complications are slang for I made a mistake. My answer to that is that we're very good at guilting ourselves. We're very good at saying that's my responsibility. You're probably aware of the system approach to error analysis. That you may have seen the Swiss cheese model, where each transaction from the first mistake to the harm that's caused to the patient is represented conceptually by a slice of Swiss cheese. And they say that the first mistake gets propagated into harm to the patient if the holes line up in each slice of Swiss cheese. It's a reminder that it's seldom one person's fault. And yet, in the culture of medicine, that shame is so deep-seated that we tend to blame ourselves. And I've met many colleagues who blame themselves for something that is clearly not their fault, and if it ever got taken to a malpractice case, they would win the case. The plaintiff would not win the case because it wasn't negligence, but we see it as negligence, and we think it's important to demonstrate that personal responsibility for what happens. I think a lot of my colleagues actually don't like the system concept because they see it as a dodge to personal responsibility. So those are some random musings, and I don't know if I've answered your question. Have I?
Yeah, I think it.
Okay.
I think the points were good. I like particularly the point about the difference between personal responsibility, which is an important component of any profession, and then the kind of that Swiss cheese model that says it's the system, and trying to find the balance in between those two. I think on a real basis is difficult sometimes.
It is difficult. It is difficult to find a balance between taking personal responsibility and system responsibility. And very few researchers are looking at the impact of shame on the behavior of people who work in healthcare. But one, Diane Aubin, who's doing a PhD thesis she's working at the Canadian Patient Safety Institute. She used to work for the Canadian Medical Protective Association, and she's doing research at the University of Alberta on shame. She's done interviews with healthcare professionals, and there's no question that in the aftermath of an error, healthcare professionals are deeply traumatized. In part because of what they do to themselves, and in part because the feeling that they've completely lost esteem. Their mask, and you were talking about that mask, it metaphorically also becomes a mask of competence that can be shattered by a mistake. And it takes careful rebuilding. It can take a long time to rebuild it, and sometimes it is rebuilt only by making a deal that you're going to leave that particular area of practice and move into a less intense area, which I think is a tragedy, because if we honored people that made mistakes and made them part of the solution instead of this gut reaction that they're part of the problem, then we would actually, not only would we save those people, but we would be able to enjoy their experience. They would be able to teach us how to avoid making mistakes. And I can tell you, I started by saying every good thing I've ever done has come from a mistake or a setback. And I hope that if I were to leave you with no other message but that one, that would be a good one to leave you with. That don't be afraid of your mistakes. At some point, you have to embrace your mistakes, because that's how you grow and get better. They may not teach you that, but I'm telling you that that's true, and that's what will keep you going on cold nights when you wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning wondering, how did that happen? Anybody else? Keep.
I just got to finish off then. Say one more time, thank you, Brian Goldman, for speaking to us today. It's fantastic. And to remind you all, he is willing to stay a little while longer and chat more informally. If you're shy, I guess you're shy and you don't want to talk on the mic. We have free food and drink over there. You're welcome to as well. So please hang around, enjoy our reception, and thank you for coming out today.